Hello and welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. Today we want to talk about hosting a web server in your home. So the term TLDR means too long and I didn't read it. We always want a simple solution, but we won't spend the time to actually learn something. Hosting your own website is actually easier than many people would have you believe, when you can go to so many hosting services to achieve this more simply, but we're not going to do that. We're actually going to prove that it is simple to do at home without extra expense. So in 2022, everybody should have their own website as a business card or as a representation of what you offer and what you can do. A Microsoft Word resume is fine, but if you're going to be seeking a job in IT, a personal website or a professional website can actually be a portfolio of what you have to offer. Everyone should self-host their own website. So, what are all the pieces? Well, you need a domain name, which is as little as $12 a year through Google, Cloudflare, or other DNS service providers. You need to define a dynamic DNS record for your domain name to point to the ISP-granted dynamic DNS WAN address assigned to your router, because that address can change. And then you need to run a reverse proxy like Nginx Reverse Proxy Manager, I call it NPM for short, to route DNS requests to services on your domain to private network addresses inside of your network. And you need to define a CNAME record for your web server and CNAME records for all of the other services that you may end up offering. Lastly, you need to install a web server on your network. So there's so many options on how to do this and so many different products out there. There's a lot of options, and I mean a lot. So WordPress is the world's most popular content management system, and it accounts for 43% of all websites. Most website implementations, to be complete, need a code management system, and if you consider only websites that have code management systems, then WordPress actually holds a 65% market share of all website installations. So because of its flexibility, its ease of use, and everything that it offers, that's why we're going to go work with WordPress. So we're going to install WordPress, and we're going to install it with a SQL Server database to manage the content management portion of your website. And we're going to use Docker to install Nginx Proxy Manager, WordPress, and SQL Server with a very simple process. And this will allow you to author your own website with a complete point-and-click interface that can be hosted on any Linux system easily, including you can do this on a Raspberry Pi. So, what about dynamic DNS? Dynamic DNS is a means of having your domain name assigned to your ISP-granted router WAN address even when it changes. So the address that your router gets from your ISP is dynamic. DDNS clients exist on lots of routers and also as programs for individual operating systems. We're going to install a Linux DDNS client that will work on either the Raspberry Pi or on Ubuntu. And we're going to create a dynamic DNS A record on your DNS service provider for your domain name. And then this will keep your domain name always pointed to your router WAN address even when that address changes. So therefore your website will always be accessible. So setting up DDNS in Raspberry Pi or Ubuntu is pretty easy. You just do a sudo apt install dd client. Now it's going to ask you a whole bunch of questions, but we're going to get over that here in a little bit. Actually, we're going to kind of avoid those questions for the most part, and we're going to go ahead and edit a file in the etc directory called ddclient.conf, which is actually what it uses, and we're going to use this as a template. this information will be in the show notes, so don't worry about viewing it right now. And then we're going to test your configuration with a command called dd client. So then we have reverse proxy. We're going to use Nginx reverse proxy, npm, as I pointed out earlier, to point your requests to your domain to specific private addresses inside of your network. We will port forward ports 80 and 443 on your router to internal private addresses and private ports where npm is running. And npm will enhance security by routing requests for domain names only to the internal systems meant to handle them. npm will allow adding, renewing, and enforcing the use of free self-signed certificates for SSL encryption from Let's Encrypt for all of your websites. So, in order to install npm, we're going to use a simple Docker compose file. And this is the simple Docker compose file. I only have a couple of things to say about this. First of all, whenever you see a Docker compose file, you can never change the port numbers to the right of the colons. The reason for that is because that's what the programmers used internally in the container. But the port number to the left of the colon can be changed to suit your needs. So if you're hosting a lot of Docker Docker containers on one Docker host, you're going to have to use different port numbers so that the services have unique port numbers. In this example, it uses port 8181 for the interface, for the web interface to configure npm, and it uses port 8080 really for port 80. So your router would have a router port forward rule that would port forward port 80 down to 8080 on this host. And it would have a port forward rule to port forward port 443 to 4443 on this host. In addition to that, we're going to have a folder called config that will store the configuration for npm. Then we're going to install WordPress and SQL Server. It's another simple Docker compose file. And basically, it has a database folder that we'll create. And then it has a root password for MySQL, a database name, and a MySQL username and a MySQL password. You can change these to make them more secure things. The only caveat is that if you change them up here, you have to change the corresponding value in the WordPress container down at the bottom here. And then we're going to have two folders, one called database, which will keep our SQL database information, and the other one called HTML, which will keep the entire WordPress file storage area. Assuming you have your domain name purchased, you want to go over to Google Domains in my example. Your domain name server provider might be different, but I go under the DNS settings, and you can see under dynamic DNS I already have Scotti-BYTE.com defined. But I'm going to go ahead and create a new dynamic DNS entry. I'm going to go down here and click Show Advanced Settings and then Manage DNS, and you can see that I have a Scotti-BYTE.com. It is a dynamic A record is what it is, and it's got my address. So I'm going to go create a new record. In this case, I'm just going to arbitrarily call it dynamic for purposes of this demo. You're not going to want to call yours dynamic because otherwise your web server would be named www.dynamic.your domain name. Okay, so we create this dynamic record. Down here at the bottom, it's hard to see, but it says your domain has dynamic DNS set up. You want to click the caret sign to the right of it and scroll down, and they have an option for view credentials. So I'm going to view the credentials of this new dynamic.scotti-byte.com dynamic DNS A record I just created. and I'm going to click on view the credentials. So they're going to provide me a username and a password, and that's what I'm going to use in the next step to set up the dynamic DNS client on the host back on my server. Here we are back on the server where we're going to install everything. I think I'm going to do a sudo apt install net-tools. That's a convenient command to show you your interface addresses. So in my case, I have ETH0 and the address of my server here is 172.16.2.2. So that's going to become important a little bit later. But for right now, sudo apt install dd client -yes. And that's going to install the dynamic DNS client. It really doesn't matter what you fill in here because we're going to replace this. So I'll just say OK, and I'll say OK, and OK, and OK, and say no, and OK, and OK, and OK. And it'll go finish installing this. Then what I'm going to do is go off and edit the dynamic DNS client file. Sudo /etc/dd client.conf. Yeah, let's try to do a sudo nano. It'll work better that way. Okay, so I'm going to delete everything in this file. That was what we got through that setup. And I'm going to paste in what I have in the show notes. So in my particular case, I'm going to go down here to generated username. And I'm going to clear this out. Go back to Google Domains. Copy the username and paste it in the login. Then I'm going to come down to the password, and you have to leave the quotes in here, but I deleted the your password. Go back over to the credentials and copy the password. And then paste the password in there. And finally, you're going to put your domain name in here, but in my case, I'm putting dynamic.scotti-BYTE.com because I already had one defined for Scotti-BYTE.com and I didn't want to mess with that one. So we do a Control X, exit, and that's all there is to it. So if you want to test this, there is a command called dd client with these qualifiers. We can run it, and it says it updated the address and it's good. And to kind of prove that, we can come over here. We can close this. And there you can see that dynamic.scotti-BYTE.com got the dynamic DNS address. Our next step is going to be to install Docker. So we'll do a sudo apt install curl in case our server doesn't have it. Once curl is installed, we're going to do a curl to install Docker. This takes just a little while. I want to go ahead and install Docker Compose with a sudo apt install docker-compose. add your user account to the Docker group with the sudo usermod -a g docker, and in my case my user account is named Scott. I do a new group Docker, and I can do a groups command, and you can see that I'm in the Scott, of course, is in the Scott group, and then I have sudo privilege and also Docker now. Now we want to make dir Docker, cd into the Docker directory, make dir npm for Nginx Proxy Manager, and make dir WordPress. So we'll cd into the npm directory first of all. So the easiest way to install Nginx Proxy Manager is to edit the docker-compose.yml file. And I had this in the show notes. Basically, the thing that's important is to make sure you're not using any of these ports on your host on the left-hand side. If they are, change them to unused port numbers. So in this case, I'm using 8181, 8080, and 4443. And then the config directory that we created is right here inside of the Docker Compose directory. And that's all there is to it. So if we do a docker-compose up and detach, it will go out and pull the Docker container that is needed, download it, and execute it. Now that Nginx Proxy Manager is installed, we want to go to the web browser and go to the address 172.16.2.2 in my case, and port 8181. The username is, the initial username is admin@example.com, and the password is change-me. So the first thing it will ask you to do is to change or edit the user. I will leave it as administrator. I'll just go ahead and change the nickname to Scott. Actually, I'll change the nickname to Scott and the full name to Scott. And then I will go ahead and change it to my email address. And save it. Then it will say, what's the current password? Well, that's change me. What's the new password? I'll go ahead and enter a password. And save. So we now have a user on here. We can log out of the administrator account. We can log back in, type in my password, and it logs me in. Okay, right now it says it has 0 proxy hosts. We're going to come back later and configure this, but we needed that as the next step. Our next step is to install WordPress. So we're going to cd back to the Docker level, do an ls, and then cd into WordPress. In the WordPress directory, we're going to do a nano docker-compose.yml and paste in what I have in the notes for the YAML file for WordPress. So WordPress wants MySQL version 5.7. We have a database volume that's going to be in a folder called database. And then you're going to have a username, or you're going to have a root password. And that's for MySQL. And you're going to have a database name, and you're going to have a username, and you're going to have a MySQL password. You want to change all of these. But when you make the change to those, you want to make sure that they coincide down here in the section for WordPress. If they're different, it's not going to work. I'm not going to change them for the demo since this is just a demo. And again, the port number that it's going to expose for the web server is going to have to be something unique. And in this case, I'm not using port 80 out here. I used 8080 for the other, but you're probably using port 80 on your server, so you're going to want to change this. And then we're going to create a database directory up here and a HTML directory down here. So I save this out. I say make dir database and make dir HTML. Do a list. There we are. I do a docker -compose space up -d. Pulls the MySQL container, and then it will pull the WordPress container after that. And now everything is installed. So we can do a docker ps, and you can see that, I stretch this out a little bit. You can see that we have a WordPress, a MySQL, and an Nginx proxy manager running. Now back at our web browser, we want to again go to the host address 172.16.2.2 in my case, but without any port number in the end because port 80 will be the default. And it goes to the WordPress setup screen. So in my case, I'm choosing English. It's going to ask me for my site title. I'll just say test. The username that I want to use to sign in for administrator purposes, I'll say Scott. And the initial password, it goes ahead and creates a strong password for you, but I'm just going to create a password called testing. Obviously, you want to use a strong password. And I'm going to confirm the use of a weak password. And my email is going to be my email. And I'm going to say install WordPress. So now it's doing the WordPress installation. Okay, it's finished with the WordPress installation. I click login. I can type my username, which is my email address, and my password was testing. I click login, and there we are. Welcome to WordPress. And then you can see a lot of sites out there which will give you instruction as to how to use WordPress, how to install your website, how to set it up and get it working. And there's lots of help out here. It's all point and click from this point on. So we have WordPress up and running, but as you can see, it's using a local address on my network. So how do we make this accessible to the internet? And the answer is we have to go back to Nginx Proxy Manager and we have to create a proxy host. So I go to the dashboard, I click on proxy host, I say add proxy host. In my case, I'm going to make this testing.scotti-BYTE.com because I already have a www.scotti-BYTE.com. So I'm just going to use this as a test, and it's going to be HTTP will be the scheme. And then we're going to say 172.16.2.2 because that's the address of my server. And the forward port, if you can remember from the container, was 80. And we can tell that if we go back up here, and you can see that there's no port number at the end of this address. Yours may differ because you might have selected a port number. You want to click on Block Common Exploits, and you want to click on WebSocket Support. Then what you want to do is you want to go to SSL and say Request a new certificate. You want to say Force SSL, and I agree to the terms. And that will go out to Let's Encrypt, and it will download and authorize a self-signed SSL certificate and make your website secure so that it will be HTTPS. And then from here, all you do is click Save to add your proxy host. Now that we have the reverse proxy record, we don't have to just address the website internally, but we can address the website externally by going to, in my case, testing.scotti-BYTE.com. And there we go. It brings up the default page because we haven't really configured anything yet, but it says test, welcome to WordPress, this is your first post, edit it, so on. So this is publicly accessible. Of course, you'd want to use the dashboard to configure your website, set up everything that you want. And basically, that is all there is to it. So, in summary, we made sure to have a domain name and assigned a DNS record for the domain name at the DNS provider. We installed and configured a DNS client configuration on your server. We installed Docker on your server, and we installed NPM in that Docker instance, and we installed WordPress with SQL Server also in Docker. And we created an NPM proxy record to make your website public. We accessed the website via the domain name using SSL. Anyway, thanks for listening today, and please subscribe and like to the channel if you like what you see, and we'll see you next time.